There is a reason behind every reason you give yourself. A purpose behind the purpose you think you're chasing. Most people never look past the first layer, the convenient why, the socially accepted why, the one that sounds good but rarely fuels anything real. But the people who change their lives, their teams, and their world do something different. They keep digging. They peel back the layers until they reach the why that shakes them awake, the why that scares them, the why that exposes what they're truly running toward or running from in a world moving faster than ever. Clarity is no longer optional. If you don't understand the deeper structure of your purpose, someone else will hand you theirs. And you will live a life that never felt like yours. Today, I want to challenge you to go deeper, to question the story you've been telling yourself, to find the why beneath the why beneath the why, because your next breakthrough is hiding in the layer you've been avoiding. The first why we give ourselves is almost always the one designed to protect our pride, not reveal our truth. Men especially are taught early to present a version of themselves that looks strong, stable, and certain, even when they feel none of those things on the inside. So when they're asked why they're pursuing a goal, why they're working so hard, or why they refuse to quit, they reach for the explanation that sounds noble, acceptable, or easy to defend. But that surface-level reason is rarely the real engine. It's the armor. It's the mask. And it keeps them from confronting the deeper forces actually shaping their decisions. The deeper truth begins to emerge when we realize that men often build their first why around expectations rather than authenticity. From a young age, they're told what success should look like and what role they should play in relationships, careers, or society. Women observing this from the outside often notice the pressure men place on themselves, the pressure to appear unbreakable, and they feel the impact of those unspoken battles. Men, however, rarely admit that their decisions are influenced by an internal scoreboard they didn't even design themselves. So the first why becomes a performance written for an audience they never questioned. The real disruption happens when we acknowledge that the first why is usually shaped by fear, not purpose. Men fear being seen as inadequate. Women, watching the men in their lives struggle silently, often recognize this fear before the men do themselves. Yet instead of naming it, men dress it up as ambition, responsibility, or duty. They say they work to provide, to build, to win. But behind that explanation is a deeper, quieter why, the need to feel worthy, respected, valuable, even irreplaceable. The first why hides this vulnerability because vulnerability feels like weakness, even though it's the doorway to clarity. The shift becomes unavoidable once we recognize that the first why is a defensive answer, not an honest one. Men use it to shield themselves from judgment, and women sense the distance it creates. Under the layers, the true why is often rooted in something raw, a desire to be understood, to be enough, to matter. And that deeper why doesn't appear until a man is willing to question the story he's been telling himself and the story others have expected him to play. The moment you reach the layer that makes you uncomfortable is the moment you finally start telling yourself the truth. Men are conditioned to stay in control, to stay composed, to stay predictable. So the idea of digging into the emotional layers they've avoided for years feels like stepping into unfamiliar territory. They fear what they might uncover. Old insecurities, past failures, unmet expectations. Women, watching from the outside, often sense these buried layers long before men acknowledge them, because discomfort reveals itself through distance, distraction, or silence. But discomfort is not the enemy. It's the signal that you finally reach something real. The reason this uncomfortable layer matters is because it challenges the stories men construct to survive. Men are often taught that emotions should be managed, minimized, or masked, so their first instinct is to create a narrative that keeps them safe. But when they peel back that protective layer, they confront the parts of themselves they've ignored, the doubts about their worth, the fear of not being needed, the anxiety of failing the people who depend on them. Women often feel this unspoken pressure because they stand close enough to notice the cracks in the facade, and they want men to understand that strength isn't found in hiding these layers, but in acknowledging them. The discomfort deepens when men begin to recognize how much of their identity was built on expectations rather than inner truth. They discover that the goals they chased, the roles they accepted, and even the relationships they pursued were often shaped by what they believed they were supposed to be, not who they actually are. Women see this conflict surface in moments when men seem distant or restless, sensing that the man they love or work with is wrestling with an internal contradiction he hasn't yet articulated. That tension between who he pretends to be and who he really is lives in the uncomfortable layer. The breakthrough comes when men stop resisting the discomfort and start exploring it. They begin asking questions they've spent years avoiding. What am I afraid to admit? What pain am I still carrying? What expectation am I trying to live up to? These questions strip away the last layer of performance and expose the foundation of their true why. Women often welcome this shift because it creates connection, vulnerability, and genuine understanding, allowing men to show up in a way that feels honest, grounded, and human. The hidden why is the force quietly steering every decision a man makes, even when his spoken explanation sounds convincing. Men often describe their choices in logical, structured ways, career moves, sacrifices, ambitions, but beneath that polished explanation lies a deeper emotional engine they rarely admit. This hidden driver is shaped by childhood experiences, wounds they never voiced, and expectations they internalize without meaning to. Women often sense this invisible force in the men around them because the hidden why reveals itself not through words, but through patterns, reactions, and the moments when a man pushes himself harder than anyone asked him to. The truth becomes clearer when we recognize that men often use their spoken why as a shield rather than a compass. They explain their actions with statements like, I need to provide, I want to succeed, or I'm doing this for my family. And while those reasons may be partly true, they don't tell the whole story. Underneath those explanations is the fear of not being enough, the desire to feel valued, or the belief that love must be earned through achievement. Women often notice when the spoken why and the lived why don't match, when a man insists everything is fine, even while he's quietly struggling to justify the weight he carries alone. The power of the hidden why is that it operates whether or not men acknowledge it. It's the reason they overcommit, overwork, or overprotect. It's the reason they react strongly to criticism or feel threatened by vulnerability. It's the reason they chase goals long after the joy has faded. Men often assume they are being rational and controlled, but women can see the emotional undercurrent that's silently influencing every step. When the hidden why is left unexamined, it becomes the unseen force that shapes a man's entire life without his conscious consent. The challenge deepens when men start to realize that their hidden why is often more honest than the words they speak aloud. It reflects what they truly crave: respect, validation, love, security, significance, and what they're terrified to lose. Women can feel the weight of this truth in relationships, friendships, and families, because unspoken motivations create unspoken tensions. When men dare to uncover this hidden why, they start to understand not just what they do, but why certain moments trigger them, why certain fears follow them, and why certain dreams never seem to let go. You can't lead anyone with conviction if you're unclear about the conviction that drives you. Men often step into leadership roles, at work, in families, in relationships, with the assumption that responsibility alone qualifies them. But leadership is not about holding a title or speaking with authority. It's about embodying a sense of purpose that others can feel. When a man hasn't decoded his core why, his leadership becomes reactive rather than intentional. Women who observe this can sense when a man is leading from obligation instead of clarity, because his direction wavers and his energy shifts depending on the pressures around him rather than the belief within him. The struggle begins when men are taught to lead based on expectations instead of identity. They're told to be strong, decisive, stable, and unwavering. But no one teaches them how to uncover the purpose that makes those qualities authentic instead of performative. Without understanding their core why, men try to mimic what leadership is supposed to look like, and it becomes exhausting. Women often see the cost of this performance, the stress behind the stoicism, the self-doubt behind the confidence, because they're close enough to notice the cracks in a man's emotional foundation. The truth becomes unavoidable when men realize that leadership built on a shallow why collapses under pressure. When challenges hit, when criticism strikes, or when uncertainty grows, the spoken reasons aren't enough to keep them anchored. Their reactions become inconsistent, their decisions become scattered, and their confidence becomes fragile. Women in their orbit feel the ripple effect of this instability, sensing that the man they rely on is wrestling with an internal conflict he can't yet articulate. The absence of a core why doesn't just weaken leadership. It creates distance, confusion, and emotional volatility, the transformation begins when a man stops leading from what he thinks others want and starts leading from who he actually is. This requires asking uncomfortable questions. What truly drives me? What fear am I trying to outrun? What value do I want to embody, not just claim? When men start digging for the deeper why, they begin to build a leadership identity rooted in authenticity rather than expectation. Women respond to this shift immediately because it creates consistency, emotional openness, and a sense of direction that feels grounded rather than forced. This is the kind of leadership people trust, not because it's perfect, but because it's real. Purpose falls apart the moment a man builds it only on the layers he's comfortable showing the world. Men often construct their sense of direction on the visible parts of their identity: skills, goals, responsibilities, achievements, because those are the parts that look stable and respectable on the surface. But underneath those outer layers lie deeper emotional truths that hold everything together. When these lower layers are ignored, the entire structure becomes fragile. Women who watch men navigate life can often sense when something in the foundation is missing, because the man's actions look strong, but his energy feels strained, uncertain, or disconnected from what he claims to stand for. The real struggle begins when men mistake the surface layers for the whole story. They focus on success, control, and proving their worth because that's what society has conditioned them to prioritize. But purpose built solely on these external markers becomes hollow over time. It can win admiration, but it rarely creates fulfillment. Women observing this dynamic often see the emotional cost long before men acknowledge it. The late nights, the quiet frustration, the subtle withdrawal from conversations that threaten to expose the cracks. The absence of deeper layers doesn't show up immediately, but it always reveals itself eventually. The tension grows when men rely on the upper layers to compensate for unresolved fears buried beneath them. Many men carry insecurities about not being enough, not being respected, or not being able to live up to expectations. Yet they push these fears deep into the lower layers instead of facing them. When these emotional foundations are weak or unexamined, the upper layers begin to wobble under pressure. Women often feel the emotional ripple effects of this instability, noticing when a man becomes overly defensive, unusually silent, or easily triggered. These reactions aren't signs of a lack of purpose. They're signs of a purpose built without anchoring its base. The breakthrough emerges when men realize that the lower layers, the vulnerable ones, are not weaknesses but structural supports. These layers hold the truths that make purpose meaningful: the desire to matter, the longing for connection, the need for acceptance, the fear of failure, and the hope of being deeply valued. When men begin peeling back the layers and acknowledging these hidden parts of themselves, their purpose becomes grounded rather than performative. Women typically welcome this shift because it softens the walls men build and replaces them with honesty, openness, and emotional depth. A purpose built from the bottom up becomes resilient because every layer supports the one above it, forming a foundation strong enough to withstand pressure, expectation, and change. Your deepest why is the quiet architect shaping the future you're building, whether you acknowledge it or not. Men often imagine their future in terms of goals, milestones, and achievements because those are the parts they can measure and control. But beneath the surface, there's another force at work, an emotional blueprint formed long before. They set those goals. This deeper why influences how they show up in relationships, how they handle pressure, and how they envision success. Women observing men closely can often sense this blueprint through the choices men make, the risks they avoid, and the standards they hold themselves to, even when they don't fully understand the source of those standards themselves. The powerful truth is that a man's deepest why is usually tied to something he rarely says aloud. It's connected to the moments that shaped him, moments of pride, moments of fear, moments when he felt invisible, or moments when he finally felt seen. These experiences form a subconscious roadmap that guides his direction far more strongly than any conscious plan. Women often detect these patterns because the deepest why shows itself in a man's emotional intensity. How fiercely he protects, how hard he pushes, how quietly he worries, and how deeply he hopes. These behaviors are not random. They're reflections of the future he's trying to create or the past he's trying to outrun. The future becomes clearer when men realize that their deepest why exposes what they value most, not what they claim to value. Men will talk about career, status, stability, or success, but their deepest why might be rooted in wanting to feel appreciated, wanting to protect their loved ones, wanting to break a generational cycle, or wanting to prove to themselves that they're worthy of the life they dream about. Women often recognize this emotional core because they see how a man behaves when the pressure increases, how he prioritizes, what he fights for, and what he sacrifices without thinking twice. The deepest why always reveals itself in those defining moments. The future a man builds becomes intentional when he dares to explore the layers beneath his spoken motivations, when he starts asking himself difficult questions. Does this matter to me? Why do I fear losing this? Why do I feel compelled to push so hard? He uncovers the emotional clarity that guides sustainable decision-making. Women often welcome this internal shift because it transforms the way men communicate, offering transparency instead of defensiveness and connection instead of distance. A man who understands his deepest why becomes easier to follow, easier to trust, and easier to build a future with because his direction no longer changes with circumstance. The most transformative discovery comes when men recognize that their deepest why isn't just influencing their future, it's defining it. The relationships they choose, the risks they take, the opportunities they pursue, and even the legacy they hope to leave are all shaped by that underlying truth. Women feel the impact of this alignment immediately because a man grounded in his deepest why moves differently, with confidence, with purpose, and with a sense of emotional honesty that makes his future not just achievable, but meaningful.